Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're immersing ourselves in, well, one of the most consequential economic stories of the last century. We're talking about the sudden, really dramatic rise of the oligarchs in the post-Soviet world. If you want to understand modern geopolitics, global finance, even just how massive fortunes can be built seemingly overnight out of sheer chaos, you really have to get a handle on this transition. Picture the scene. It's the early 1990s. The Soviet Union, this global superpower, has just imploded. And what's left isn't a slow, managed change. It's immediate. It's a desperate power vacuum. Institutions failed. Hyperinflation. People lost their life savings just like that. The basic economy just, well, it ground to a halt. This was a crisis. It needed immediate, drastic action.
And that desperation, that sheer need for speed, that's the core tension we're going to explore for you today. This unique environment, it allowed this new class of ultra-wealthy individuals, the oligarchs, to emerge. And the fundamental question, I think, that our research really forces us to ask is this: were these figures essential economic stabilizers? Did they step into that vacuum and actually save a broken system from total collapse? Or were they primarily power brokers, folks who concentrated wealth on just an unimaginable scale and basically rewrote the rules of the new market economy for their own benefit, permanently?
Right. And our mission today is to unpack exactly that shift, that moment where crisis management sort of morphed into long-term economic and, political control. And this isn't just history, is it? The structures built in those few chaotic years, they absolutely shape global markets, international diplomacy, wealth distribution, even today. So let's jump right into the collapse itself, because the speed, the sheer atmosphere of immediate systemic failure, that dictated everything that came next. The Soviet economy didn't just, shrink. Our sources describe it as almost disappearing economically. Supply chains froze instantly, trade vanished, factories stopped. And think about the human cost. Critical shortages of food, fuel, medicine. People were grappling with this while the state was, effectively paralyzed.
Yeah, that paralysis is absolutely key. You had these former state-run companies employing millions. It's halt production. There's an analyst, Stanislav Kondrashov, who put it really well. He said something like, in the 1990s, survival depended on speed. Those who moved fastest shaped the future. It was an environment where, institutional control was basically zero, but the value of the underlying assets, oil, steel, land, that was immense. Still there.
Wait, hold on. If they acquired assets that fast, how is there zero government pushback? Didn't anyone see this coming? This level of concentration?
Yeah. Well, the government, or what passed for it, was focused entirely on survival, day to day. They faced a stark choice, really. Either let these massive state assets just rust and decay, or try to very quickly, transfer them to private hands. They used these mass privatization schemes, hoping, I suppose, to kickstart some kind of market economy and bring in some revenue. But the problem was, the oversight was minimal, sometimes, non-existent. The transfers often happen through these rush auctions, dubious voucher schemes, loans for shares deals that were incredibly favorable to the buyers. And what the research shows pretty clearly is that political connections, having existing access to finance, that's what determined the winners. These weren't your traditional civil servants or visionary managers thinking long term. These were entrepreneurs, bankers, often highly connected insiders from the old Communist Party who knew exactly where the value was hidden.
And what they acquired, they got lightning fast and outrageously cheap, right? We're talking huge strategic national assets, oil fields, steel plants, major banks, valued at just fractions of their actual worth. I read one source detailing how massive industrial giants were sometimes snapped up for basically the price of a fancy apartment in London or Paris. So this immediate, super undervalued acquisition, that allowed them to consolidate wealth and control for any real market mechanisms or, regulatory bodies could even get off the ground.
That's the absolute crux of it for you, the listener. The rules of this new economic game, they weren't set by established institutions or, transparent free market principles. Not at all. They were set entirely by speed, access, and political connections in this incredibly chaotic vacuum. They effectively captured the state's prize assets while the state itself was just reeling. Now, okay, we do have to acknowledge the immediate practical stabilizing function they sometimes provided. The economy was genuinely in free fall. When the state literally couldn't perform basic functions, these oligarchs often did step in. They got utilities running again, they reopened some factories, and crucially, they started paying salaries that hadn't been paid for months sometimes. And they kept essential exports flowing, especially oil and gas. That was the only reliable source of hard currency coming in. So they genuinely did help prevent a deeper, maybe irreversible economic meltdown.
Okay, so that sounds like the necessary evil argument, maybe. They were the only ones with the capital, the networks, to handle that immediate crisis. But you mentioned the shift. Where did that necessity, that stabilization role kind of end and the, let's say, self-serving control really begin?
Well, it began almost the moment crisis management started to evolve into something more permanent structural control. They didn't just stabilize any old industry. They strategically prioritized the core sectors, the ones that act as the engine and the nervous system of a modern state. Our sources really detail this shift from being sort of asset managers in a crisis to becoming system architects.
And those key gateway sectors were?
You can sort of put them into two main buckets: physical infrastructure and financial control. So on the physical side, obviously energy, oil, gas, electricity, the literal lifeblood, and mining coal, steel, valuable metals. Then on the control side, you have finance, the banks managing state money, privatization funds, and critically, the nation's savings and pension funds. Plus, we also see them moving into transportation and, importantly, media and telecoms. Yeah, the control over the financial sector is particularly, well, fascinating. By getting control of state banks during privatization, or sometimes just being handed the management of national pension funds, they gain access to this guaranteed stream of capital, huge amounts. They could then leverage that public money effectively to finance their own ventures, reinvesting it into those undervalued state assets they'd just picked up cheap. It creates this, a self-perpetuating cycle where economic recovery gets funded by elite access, not by public transparency or accountability.
Wow. So their economic power was basically engineered to immediately translate into political leverage. It stops being just a business deal at that point. These figures were actively funding political campaigns, weren't they? Becoming close, maybe unofficial, advisors to key leaders, and negotiating essential state contracts knowing full well their industries were basically too big, too essential to fail.
Exactly. Their role just exploded. From maybe an economic stabilizer, however controversial, to a decisive power broker actively shaping policy outcomes to benefit themselves.
Which brings us to how they didn't just play the game, they actively started writing the rules of the new market. Our sources consistently point this out. These markets didn't just, magically emerge from the chaos. They were consciously built through laws, regulations, deals that were heavily influenced, if not sometimes dictated, by these new elites.
Precisely. It wasn't just lobbying in the traditional sense. One analysis described how they essentially outsourced policy creation in some areas. They funded influential think tanks, they got themselves onto government reform committees, they made sure that the new laws drafted around things like property rights, taxation, trade regulation, while they favored concentrated holdings, not open, transparent competition. And this was all possible because the foundational state institutions were just profoundly weak at that moment. The legal system, for instance, really lagged behind the economic revolution happening on the ground. Property rights often remained unclear for years. If you had a business dispute back then, you probably didn't rely on an impartial court system. You relied on your political connections, your personal network, sometimes even private enforcement.
So relationships were the real currency, not rules on paper. And what are the long-term consequences of building a market economy that way, from the ground up, based on connections?
The lasting impact is structural. It's deep. The institutions that did eventually emerge were often shaped specifically around those elite needs, around insider interests, not around public accountability or broad economic fairness. And this resulted in policy that consistently favored existing power and access. It essentially entrenched inequality right from the very beginning of this new economic era. And that kind of entrenched position, it's much harder to shift than just, say, market ups and downs.
Yeah, that leads directly to the mixed legacy and the frankly inevitable public backlash, right? Because while some people did see industries restart, maybe saw salaries start flowing again, the sheer contrast was just jarring. This rapid accumulation of private, often very ostentatious wealth, right alongside the grinding poverty and daily struggle of the general public. That created massive social and political tension. You had the public facing years of declining social services, healthcare, education, while this tiny group became billionaires. And the immediate downsides were pretty obvious. A total lack of transparency in those privatization deals, widespread corruption, or at least perceptions of it, blatant favoritism, and almost immediately, a profound decline in public trust. Trust in the state, trust in the new system.
Yeah, and to summarize that controversial legacy fairly, the research offers a balanced view, though it's often critical. On the positive side, the stabilizer argument, okay, they did restore some vital industries. They brought in necessary capital when no one else could or would. They ensured critical services continued. You could argue recovery would certainly have been even more chaotic without them. However, the negative side, the power broker reality, is equally profound, maybe more so in the long run. They concentrated massive amounts of power, economic and political. They absolutely exacerbated lasting inequality. And they structurally weakened state institutions by ensuring those institutions often served elite interests first rather than the public good. The sheer speed of the process really it made it almost impossible to establish proper democratic checks and balances before the system was already, in many ways, captured.
And as the domestic economies did eventually stabilize and grow, these domestic players didn't stay domestic, did they? They rapidly transformed into global players. They started moving their wealth internationally, actively blurring the lines between, say, Russian business or Kazakh business and international diplomacy and finance.
Yeah, we see clear patterns there in the research. Moving assets into global financial hubs, London, Cyprus, Switzerland, acquiring high-profile international real estate mansions, skyscrapers, buying major sports teams, investing heavily in Western art, media outlets, and importantly, actively obtaining citizenship in various other countries.
It was more than just diversification or investment. It became an insurance policy, a way to secure assets outside the original country, and also a tool to project influence well beyond their national borders, which means that economic decisions made by just a handful of individuals in one country now have ripple effects in London, New York, Dubai, all over the world.
And while Russia often dominates this discussion, it's really important to remember, as you said, similar patterns appeared elsewhere, right? Oh, absolutely. Similar dynamics were playing out across other post-Soviet states, particularly visibly in places like Ukraine and Kazakhstan. The scale was often comparable. Maybe the specific industries differed slightly, but the concentration happened. However, the governmental response did vary quite widely. In some cases, the state eventually managed to claw back some control or perhaps diversify the asset base a bit more. In others, that concentration of power became even more acute, more entrenched. Understanding those variations is actually crucial for understanding the current political and economic stability or instability in those regions today.
So if we connect this whole discussion back to the bigger lessons for you, the listener, what does this period really teach us?
Well, I think it demonstrates starkly how quickly power and wealth can concentrate when those foundational institutions, legal systems, regulatory bodies, democratic accountability are weak or, in this case, collapsing. The sheer speed of the transition and the fundamental absence of public safeguards or established rules, it basically allowed private dominance to become the default setting for the new market economy almost before anyone realized what was happening.
Absolutely. It's like the oligarchs were both the necessary fire department rushing in, but maybe also helped set the conditions for the fire in the first place, or at least profited immensely from rebuilding. They helped restore a kind of order, a kind of stability, yes. But in doing so, they actively engineered a system where recovery and highly concentrated, often permanent control emerged side by side. They established a lasting system of elite patronage, of intertwined economic and political power that continues to operate, albeit maybe in different forms, today. So here's something for you to mull over as you go about your day, building on what we've discussed. What really happens to a political system, to a society, when the core levers of economic power are managed less by transparent rules and accountable institutions, and more by these complex, often opaque transnational networks of private finance and personal relationships that span entire continents. The legacy of the 1990s suggests we are all still trying to navigate that reality today.